Thank you. It's a tremendous honor to be here, and I really appreciate the time. So I'm recognizing that I'm standing between you and lunch, I believe. Is that right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluating the effectiveness of family justice centers as we've done some of that work with Casey. I'm not going to spend time talking about how family justice centers are more efficient in terms of time, how they increase safety. Some of those things have already been said. What I'd like to talk about is how family justice centers and their programs impact hope of survivors and their children. So essentially, I have had three driving questions. And so the first one was, what is the impact of family justice centers on survivor hope and well-being? I think the second question is probably a little more important to me right now in this journey, and that is, what is the relationship between hope and survivor-defined success? One of the projects that we're taking on over this next year or so is to begin interviewing survivors to better understand how they define success, not how criminal justice system defines success necessarily, but what does success look like from a survivor perspective? What does success look like during intake? What does success look like during the protective order process? What does success look like in case management? So that there's not a one-size-fits-all model of success, but that success becomes individualized as a client transitions through the Family Justice Center services. And then ultimately, what is the impact of Camp Hope on children exposed to domestic violence? So I'm going to show you just a little bit of information on that. As you develop your Family Justice Center, the movement and the awareness, we've had that this morning on the traumatic experiences across the lifespan. We've been focused on adverse childhood experiences today because that's where most of the science is from Dr. Folletti and others. But I also want to highlight that while the ACE information is so significant and important in advancing our understanding of trauma, it's restricted to what happened to you during your childhood. It doesn't assess such traumatic events as community violence, for instance. It doesn't impact or assess immigration, bullying in classrooms, and on and on. So that's the polyvictimization work that's taking place with the Family Justice Center now, is expanding that measurement. So as we begin to look at trauma-informed practices, one of the things that Casey and I talk about pretty constantly is this idea of what do we do once we understand trauma? What is the next step? And so as the movement begins to recognize trauma and integrate trauma-informed practice, the next step then is to become hope-centered. How do we recognize trauma, and then when the moment is right, begin to look towards the future of what the goals the survivors and their families might have? So that's the framework for the way in which we evaluate programs and services. And so what I'll highlight, I'm not going to get deep into hope. I'll do that this afternoon during the breakout session and tomorrow as well. But there are over 2,000 published studies on hope as we study it. And those 2,000 published studies are very consistent. Hope tends to be the single best predictor of well-being, however well-being is defined across different disciplines. It's a significant predictor of goal achievement, reduced suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, and enhanced well-being. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a few moments, but in the United States, when we study hope scores among our youth in middle school and high school, what we find is that hope scores among children are predictive of academic achievement outcomes. And what we're finding is that it is now a better predictor of first-year college success than our traditional measures of entrance exams and high school GPA. So it's a tremendous strength, psychological strength, that we have the opportunity to possess. The one thing, and Casey mentioned it earlier when he mentioned, and I tend to get this all the time, people tell me I can't measure hope. And it is true, I am arrogant in the sense that I do believe very strongly that I can measure anything. And I firmly do believe that I can do that. But hope is easily measured in both adults and children. And we have validated scales for use with that. I do a lot of work with child maltreatment, child abuse programs, and working with child therapists. Some of the therapists inform me that they can behaviorally see an 18-month-old child lose hope in a caregiver. So after my heart broke when I heard that, I became very intrigued. And so working with that, we've ultimately developed a behavioral observation measure of hope of a child to a caregiver and the hope of a caregiver to a child, and see tremendous predictive power of increasing hope on parent-child relationship qualities. We know that hope can be increased through simple interventions. The real question is whether we can sustain hope once we raise it. And then ultimately, what we would argue is that hope is a social gift. Hope is something that can be shared between individuals. And more importantly, one of the things we'll be working on over the next couple of years is how do we integrate a hope-centered culture in the workplace so that we can begin to harness that hope when a survivor first walks through the front doors of a family justice center. Hope is the belief that your future will be better than today and that you will have the power to make it so. Now, let me clarify that real quickly. When we talk about hope, what we're referring to is that you have the ability to set goals, to set meaningful goals in your life. But more importantly, that you have the capacity to identify the strategies or the roadmap to achieve those goals. What we find with high trauma children and survivors of abuse is that setting long-term goals become very difficult. In fact, survivors tend to be really good at 24 to 48 hours thinking about goals. Beyond that becomes difficult. Trauma also impacts individuals' ability to plan or set the roadmaps to the future. So it's goals, pathways, and then the final piece is willpower, and that is our motivational framework to pursue and achieve our goals. Now, what I want to highlight before I talk a little bit about some of the findings is some of the data, some of the research that we're finding identifies that both high hope and low hope individuals set goals. It's the nature of those goals that matter. So what we've learned is that high hope individuals tend to set achievement goals. These are goals of things that I want to pursue that may stretch me. So, for instance, my first semester GPA in college is a 0.58, and I don't know if your GPA system is that, but basically I failed every class and got a B in advanced swimming and life-saving. I like to swim. Now, when I went back to college, there's a little bit of a story there, by the way, but when I went back to college, I decided that I wanted to be a professor at a university. And so becoming a professor at a university, starting out with a 0.5 out GPA, that's a stretch goal. That's an achievement goal. And it's a goal that I could only achieve through important social connections in my life at that time and beyond. So social connectedness matters. Here's the real kicker, is that low hope individuals tend to set avoided goals. They're more likely to set goals of things they don't want to happen. And so one of the things that we're interested in evaluating family justice centers are, do those frameworks push achievement goals, or do their processes demand that survivors set up avoidant goals, like avoiding something from happening? And so we're really interested in what a hope-centered organization or a hope-centered family justice center looks like. We know how to nurture hope. We know how to do this work. And this is the process. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the breakout session. It starts with goal setting. It begins with identifying viable pathways. When you do hope work, when we think about hope in the context that we've had so far today, we need to be sure that we can differentiate hope, which is the belief that tomorrow will be better than today and I have the power to make it so, is the different than the way we talk about a wish. A wish is something I'm motivated to occur, but I have no control over the outcome, or I have no control over the pathways. So a hope and wish are very different. We also have to make sure that we distinguish hope from fantasy in our conversations. Okay. So we did a study about 2 years ago now in all the family justice centers in California participated. And you've heard a little bit about the adverse childhood experiences and those scores. So this is the self-reported average ACE score of the survivors who participated in the study, average ACE score of a 3.3. Remember, those scores range from a 0 to a 10. You can't really see, I think, in the back, so I apologize for the size of the graph. But what I want to point out is a couple of things. These are just the ACE scores ranging from a 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more. In the ACEs work, an ACE score of 4 or higher is a tipping point in which really bad outcomes start to manifest themselves, as I think Stephen highlighted some of those examples. The middle column shows the U.S. nationally representative sample of ACE scores. And you can see that in the U.S., at the population level, a little over a third of the population has an ACE score of 0. The important takeaway for this, for us in the States, is that ACE scores are common. Right? It's uncommon. It's more uncommon to have an ACE score of 0. That is, adversity is prominent in the States. And so this idea of stigmatizing childhood adversity needs to be dealt with. The second thing that I'll point out is that about 12 to 13% of the population have an ACE score of 4 or higher, that tipping point. With the survivors, 43% of them have an ACE score of 4 or higher. The average ACE score for the United States is a 1.61 at the national level. So survivors are coming in with a much higher level of trauma. And we actually think that they're sort of rationalizing that those scores are actually underreported or low. So what we did with the Family Justice Center, the California Family Justice Centers, was really a pilot model to see if we could begin to assess outcomes in a Family Justice Center model. And so we did a pre-test, post-test type design where we measure hope when survivors come in during the intake process. And then we attempt to follow up about 45 to 65 or 60 days after services. And what we see is a significant increase in a survivor's hope. We see a significant increase in that. Now, what's probably more important is what that relates to. So what happens when we increase hope? And we see significant relations between hope and quality of life indicators or well-being. We see significant associations between hope and survivor-defined goals. So we actually tried to implement that. By the way, we also saw significant increases or improvements in the ability to self-regulate for survivors. So this is the ability to manage their emotional reactions to their circumstances. So all of those are indicators of important psychological well-being frameworks. So I'm a quantitative psychologist, as Casey mentioned. For those of you who don't know what a quantitative psychologist is, I studied statistics. My goal in college was to never work with people, to never travel to Northern Ireland and stand in front of a large crowd in a gorgeous room in a very complex, beautiful city talking about hope. That's not what I trained to do. So I get nervous, and my comfort level is to show you numbers. But basically, it's just showing significant moderate to strong associations between hope and well-being. What I further want to show you is that it became the single best predictor of well-being among survivors. That is, the significant associations of emotional regulation, the significant relationship, basically dissipate in the presence of hope. Hope is the key factor to focus on when you're interested in improving the well-being of survivors in this context. You've heard a little bit about Camp Hope. I was really excited last night to learn that you guys will have or pursue the Camp Hope model here. I will tell you as a researcher, if you want to invest time and your resources into something that will change a child's life, Camp Hope is it. I've never seen results so strong, so consistently on the impact of Camp Hope among children exposed to domestic violence. Very, very impressive. So this is the ACE score for these children. And what we see is that over half of the children report an ACE score of 4 or higher. Again, that tipping point. By the way, average age of the children here is 10 years. And their average ACE score at this time was already a 4. So they still have time to accumulate more. And so what do we know about, without intervention, what happens to children exposed to domestic violence? There's an increase in psychological, physical, and social success. There's higher rates of criminality. There's higher rates of either being a victim or being a perpetrator of violence as well. And so these are the group of kids to focus on. And so what I want to show you is that among these high trauma children, here are the 10 categories of ACEs. Again, you can't really see those. I'll point out a couple. 80% of these children report witnessing the domestic violence. 45% have a parent incarcerated. 49%, 50% report verbal abuse, 40% physical abuse. So the highlight of this ACEs work with these Camp Hope children and the importance of this was to begin to demonstrate that children aren't just exposed to domestic violence. That is, having that adversity is associated with having these other additional adversities in their life. It's not just domestic violence that they're being exposed to. These children are, in fact, polyvictims. So here is in fact, you should probably give me a drum roll kind of thing. Hey, thank you. So this is the increase in hope. And I want to contextualize this. We measure hope about 30 days before camp. And the reason we do that is we don't want a child getting on a bus going to this wonderful facility and being excited. We want it filled out way in advance of camp. And every camp is a little bit different, but essentially the post-test, the middle score, is measured about the last evening or day of camp. This is when the children are about to go home. And then the 30-day follow-up. As you can see, the scores increase. Now let me contextualize that. In the United States, the research on hope and educational attainment shows that a 2-point increase in a child's hope scores, which is what we see in that first increase, a 2-point increase in a child's hope is a letter grade in the classroom. So it doesn't just impact their well-being, it impacts their academic achievement. It impacts their potential for success in the future. And so those were the 2 studies that I wanted to take the brief amount of time to share with you. We're doing a tremendous amount of other research that I'll talk about a little bit more this afternoon. But what I want to highlight is that the essence of hope is when we can recognize the way things are today in our lives and begin to imagine the way things could be. And I think that's the essence of the Family Justice Center movement, is it gives people the opportunity to think about the way things could be, right? And so ultimately, the future will be better, and survivors have the power to make it so. That's the essence of hope as the integrated conceptual framework of the outcomes for success. So I think that's it.